Over a year ago, I beat what I considered to be the hardest Yu-Gi-Oh game ever made, which a decent portion of you were very keen on telling me that I was in fact dead wrong. And the hardest Yu-Gi-Oh game in existence was actually Reshef of Destruction for the Game Boy Advance, which I will admit, I have never played before, and from looking at various forums and Reddit posts comparing the difficulty of the two, there seems to be some sort of argument for both sides. But before I go and attempt Reshef of Destruction myself, let me try and make my argument for Forbidden Memories just one more time, by not just showing the hardest Yu-Gi-Oh game ever made, but the hardest category within that game. The 100% category of Forbidden Memories follows the same goal as normally beating the game, except you also have to unlock every single duelist within Free Duel, as well as unlocking every single card in the library, which is 722 unique cards. And while some may argue that just adding more unlocks only adds to the tediousness and RNG to the run and doesn't actually add difficulty, you may have a point. But as the fastest ever recorded time to complete this challenge is still over 72 hours of gameplay, the consistency required in order to have the highest odds of unlocking each and every one of these cards over the course of 3 days of playtime definitely makes it more difficult to pull off. When starting any run of Forbidden Memories, you're given a starting deck, and every single card that starts in your deck already counts towards your overall collection, with every other card being unlocked through defeating opponents or by purchasing them with star chips that are gained after every battle. With the starting deck, there are a few things that you're going to be looking out for, in particular, which is Raigeki as well as Follow Wind. With a starting deck, you're always guaranteed one removal card in Raigeki or Dark Hole, and one equip card, which can be from a much larger list. And the reason you want Raigeki over Dark Hole is that it is much harder to unlock than Dark Hole, and it's also just a much stronger card. Raigeki will destroy all of your opponent's monsters, while Dark Hole will clear the entire board, and just by having a much better board wipe, every single battle is going to be easier to win, making it much easier to grind new cards to unlock. As for Follow Wind, it is less of a hard requirement when compared to Raigeki to be in your starting deck, but as equip cards are one of the most annoying cards to grind to unlock due to the requirements and having a chance to get one, starting off with the most annoying one can potentially benefit you greatly. If you watched my video where I beat this game for the first time or have any experience playing this game, you will know that it's pretty important to have as many Thunders as well as Dragons in your starting deck, as the illustrious twin-headed Thunder Dragon is the best and most consistent fusion monster to use in the game. But this is much less important to have at the very start in 100%, as during the first hour or two, you're just going to have to grind against some of the very easy opponents to stack up some of the early cards. And this will typically just get you a decent amount of Dragons and Thunders to upgrade before you face off against anyone that's actually difficult. But once you have a starting deck that at the bare minimum has a Raigeki in it, a 100% run can begin. And as with any normal playthrough of the game goes, your fairy versus opponent is Simon. And for anyone unfamiliar with how Forbidden Memories gameplay works, this is basically all you need to know. Forbidden Memories was made during a time where the rules of Yu-Gi-Oh weren't solidified, so this game plays extremely differently from the card game, and especially the modern card game. Any card can be played onto the field no matter what its summoning cost. If you have a Blue Eyes White Dragon in your hand, you can just place it down however you please, which if this seems broken to you, it most certainly is. Towards the end of the game, your opponents will just place down Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragons and Gate Guardians basically every single round, not to mention with potentially 1 or even 2 Megamorphs on top of them, making them near impossible to deal with. Another way to play strong monsters is to fuse into them. Every single card in Forbidden Memories has a type associated with it, such as Fairy, Zombie, Dragon, and Thunder, to name a few. And depending on what types you fuse together, can make stronger monsters, such as creating a mystical elf when combining any elf and fairy together, which is where twin-headed Thunder Dragon comes into play. When combining any Thunder with any Dragon, as long as one of them has at least 1600 attack, you will get a twin-headed Thunder Dragon, and this is the most consistent way to compete with most of the stronger monsters in the game that your opponents will have, as the only opponents that will reward you with those insanely high-power monsters, are the ones that have the high-powered monsters, which will have to be defeated first with just the twin-headed. And the last two important aspects of Forbidden Memories are that you can only place one card onto the field per turn, but with the use of fusing, you can actually play all 5 cards in your hand in order to search for better cards in your deck. If you play all 5 cards in your hand, they will go off in order, trying to fuse with one another, and using any equips in the chain, as well as with any non-compatible cards just being discarded. And lastly, there is a planet and moon trait with each card, which can be pretty easily understood if compared to something like type advantages in Pokemon. Basically, every card has a symbol associated with it, such as Moon or Venus, and that type is weak or powerful against other types. And whenever one type is strong against the other, that monster will have an additional 500 attack whenever attacking that monster. And that's basically all you need to know about the mechanics of Forbidden Memories. The main skill comes from remembering all possible fusions and which ones make strong monsters, as well as just being able to gain the momentum in a battle, since only one card can be played every single turn, which is why Raigeki can be so important, as it can swing the game very heavily in your favor, especially if you're down 2 or 3 monsters. After defeating Simon, you then have to head to the duel grounds, defeating every person there, finishing off with Jono 1 as well as Seto 1, which the 1 just delineates which version of that opponent you are facing. But after finishing off the dueling grounds, the first small grind of the run starts and is basically done just to make sure the next section can be beaten fairly easily. When grinding for cards in Forbidden Memories, each specific opponent has their own drop table, or to be more specific, each opponent has 3 distinct drop tables. Whenever a match is finished, you'll be given a rank depending on how well you did, and in what fashion you beat your opponent, which are grouped into either POW rank or Tech rank, each containing ratings from S down to D. And depending on the rank you get, you will roll from a unique drop table, with the 3 drop tables being grouped into S and A POW ranks, S and A Tech ranks, and the largest group being from B, C, and D ranks from both POW and Tech. So depending on which drop table you are trying to hit, you have to play the game much different, which if you remember me mentioning that equip cards are the most annoying to unlock, them being within S and A Tech drop tables is the reason for this, but we'll talk more about that later. For the first grind of the run, your 2 main goals are to get enough Dragons and Thunders to have a strong enough deck to beat the next section of the game, as well to make sure to keep going until you unlock Time Wizard from Jono 1. Time Wizard can only be obtained from 3 opponents in the entire game: Simon, Yamibakura, and Jono. But due to the fact that Simon and Yamibakura aren't used to unlock cards after defeating the initial time in the main story, this is the only section that Time Wizard can be unlocked, and it's sitting at around a 3% drop rate in every single rank from Jono 1. There are some other good cards to look out for, in particular Fake Trap, which can only be obtained within the BCD ranks. So until Fake Trap is obtained, BCD should be the goal. Otherwise, once your deck is strong enough and you have Time Wizard, then the first small grind of the run is done. And I guess it's time to actually talk about what the difference is between all of these ranks, as they're going to come up very often throughout this entire run. Whenever you enter a duel in Forbidden Memories, there's a hidden value of 50 points that will be used to determine your rank. And the general strategy in order to get POW ranks, you want to win very quickly, or with power, which is what POW stands for, without losing much life, and without using many equips or magic cards. Basically winning very fast with only big monsters. And in order to get Tech ranks, you want to win in a more technical fashion, with things such as winning with very few cards left in your deck, using a ton of equips or trap cards, winning on very low health, and so on. Essentially every single play you make within a duel will affect this score, with POW ranks being the standard or inherent way you just typically want to play, making them a bit easier to get, especially if your deck's power level far exceeds your opponent. Achieving Tech ranks, in particular S and A Tech ranks, are much harder and tedious to pull off, but for most people doing the grind, this is the typical way to get a Tech rank that high. Going back to the 50 starting points for your determining rank, ending the round with anywhere from 0 to 20 points will give you either S or A Tech ranks, and a good way to lower your score down to less than 20 are the following. Fuse 15 or more monsters for -12 points, activate a trap card for -8 points, activate 1 magic for -4 points, using 1 equip card nets you with 0, having less than 7,000 remaining life also nets you with 0, playing 1 card face down gives you -2, having 9 turns pass gives you 0, and having less than 3 cards remaining in your deck gives you -7 points, with having the total points at the end of the game being 18. There are multiple strategies you can take in order to reach S or A Tech rank, such as using more equipped cards, having less life at the end of the round, gaining effective attacks against your opponents, which are done where you deal damage to a monster, and overflow hurts your opponent, and so on. But as you can see, Tech ranks are extremely tedious to get, and is one of the reasons getting Fake Trap is so important early on, as just 1 trap card will lower your score by 8 points. And if you're curious about the things that give you 0 points, if you only let 8 turns pass, for example, you actually gain points towards your score, meaning that every single one of these categories matters, as ignoring them could gain you unnecessary points, giving you BCD rank. And to show just how much easier S and A power ranks are, this is all you have to do. You just have to win in 4 turns or less for 12 points, have 8,000 life at the end of the game for 6 points, and just use less than 8 cards for 15 points. And that's it. If you're strong enough to win that fast, you can get S and A power ranks 10 times faster than you can get S or A tech ranks. And there's barely any mental math that has to be done in order to keep up with every single thing you've checked off the list during each duel, which also shows why getting the follow when equip card at the very start could potentially save a decent amount of headache. After the first grind, the next section is just to defeat the World Tournament, which, if good enough cards have been obtained, isn't that difficult to pull off, with the hardest opponents being Pegasus or Kaiba, with their strongest potential monsters being Meteor Black Dragon at 3,500 and Blue Eyes White Dragon at 3,000, respectively. After the World Tournament is beaten, you have to go through a bit more progression through the main story until you unlock the lower mages, which is where the next grind begins. Only this time, instead of grinding for an hour or two to get a few good cards in the Time Wizard, this grind can be about 20 hours, and it mainly involves getting S and A tech ranks. The main point of this grind is that the last few opponents within the game are going to be farmed for drops later on, and they're extremely difficult to beat with unfair mechanics as well as unfair decks. So farming for the best possible cards to have going into those duels is the most important part of this section. In order to get the cards that we want to progress to the rest of the story, we have to make sure we have a decent enough deck that can get A tech ranks consistently. As mentioned before, there are a ton of requirements that have to be met in order to receive A tech rank. So farming BCD ranks on opponents such as Kaiba in order to get traps, if you never got the fake trap against Jono, is extremely important. And once you have a trap card in your deck, the Pegasus grind can begin. The main reason Pegasus is one of the most important farms in the game is that Pegasus is the only opponent that can reliably drop Megamorph, disregarding the final duelist of the game, and Megamorph is by far the strongest equip, being able to target any monster and giving them a 1000 boost, as opposed to every other equip giving 500. And as mentioned before, the final duelists of the game are extremely difficult, with some of the strongest monsters being Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon sitting at 4,500 attack. So with our trusty twin-headed Thunder Dragon, or hopefully a few Meteor Black Dragons later on, we will need at least 1 Megamorph, if not 2, on every single monster we play in order to consistently deal with those final opponents. Pegasus has a 3% chance to reward you with Megamorph on any successful S or A tech victory. And even though the requirement to 100%ing the game is just to unlock 1 of every card, having a minimum of 2 Megamorph going into the rest of the game will make the remainder of the run so much more consistent and end up saving potentially 10 or more hours by having a more consistent deck in order to get more consistent wins against the very difficult duelists. While searching for Megamorphs against Pegasus, some other extremely strong cards to get are Bright Castle or Dragon Treasure, which can also boost the power level of your dragons, or trap cards such as Widespread Ruin that can help deal with your opponent's extremely strong monsters. Since Pegasus is mainly used for his chance to drop Megamorph, once you have at the very minimum 2 of them, you can begin farming some other opponents that also have unique drops, while also giving you a decent chance to help the later duels easier. Kaiba has the chance to drop Warrior Elimination, which, while dropped by a handful of other opponents, has a decent drop chance out of the A tech rank, and it still drops a decent amount of equips as well as trap cards. And just to reiterate, the entire grind against Pegasus as well as Kaiba are entirely done with A tech ranks. So while some of these drops come in at a 3% chance, every single duel you have to play out just about every single card from your deck. Used every monster you can, as well as meeting all the previously mentioned requirements for every single duel for the entire duration of this farm. Even in a normal playthrough of this game, Pegasus, just due to the fact that he can drop Megamorph, is a great opponent to farm on. And while typically just 1 Megamorph can win you the game, grinding for A tech ranks can become extremely tedious, having to keep track of every single thing that you have to do each duel, and if you forget just one aspect of it, can result in a BCD rank, essentially making the last 5 minutes for nothing. And you just have to do it again and again and again. But once at least 2 Megamorphs have been obtained, as well as Warrior Elimination, and at least 5 or 6 equips in total, it's time for the much more exciting and much faster grind, getting A POW ranks on Meadow Mage. Meadow Mage is another opponent that is extremely useful to farm against in any playthrough of this game, as they have the chance to drop MBD, or Meteor Black Dragon, which is going to be the best card that you can find, and when equipped with a Megamorph, is going to be just as strong as Blue Eyes Ultimate. While getting POW ranks is much quicker than Tech ranks, Meadow Mage sadly only has a 1% chance to reward you with MBD, and similar to the Megamorph, even though only one is required to 100% the game, having multiple will make the rest of the run much easier, hoping to have at least 3 or 4 before continuing on. Meadow Mage also has a chance to drop Skull Knight, which, while weaker than MBD, can provide almost the same utility, so having some of those can count as well. Meadow Mage also has some other decently strong monsters that can help with fusions later on, but the main goal overall is MBD, as the second best option is getting one from Yugioh 2, which has the abysmal drop rate of 0.4%. After collecting enough MBDs and Skull Knights, the only other drops that are necessary before proceeding are Meteor Dragon from Meadow Mage and Red Eyes Black Dragon from Yugioh 2, as he is the only opponent in the game that will ever reward you with Red Eyes at around a 1% drop chance. The next section of the run is just completing the normal story of the game, which, even with all of the drops that have been farmed, it still isn't a walk in the park. There are some mages that have to be defeated, which in a normal playthrough are pretty difficult to beat, but with all the preparation done for 100%, shouldn't be that big of a problem. The only issue comes from the final 6. At the very end of the game in Forbidden Memories, depending on the route of the story you took, there are either 6 or 7 extremely difficult opponents that you have to defeat consecutively. And I'm not going to pretend like this is the most difficult part of a 100% run, but in a normal playthrough, these opponents are brutal. Assuming you never spent the 10 hours to gain 3 Megamorphs or 5 hours collecting Meteor Black Dragons, every single opponent in the final 6 by default has a monster that is at a base level already stronger than your twin-headed Thunder Dragon, with each opponent having increasingly difficult monsters to face, and not to mention, all 6 opponents have to be beaten in a row. If you lose to number 6, you have to completely restart and try again with number 1. But this isn't a normal playthrough. With consistent draws and megamorphing your Meteor Black Dragons, most every opponent can be taken down pretty easily, with the exception of any Gate Guardians with Megamorph or Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragons. But after a couple of attempts, can be taken down pretty quickly. And after defeating the final boss of the game, this is where a normal run of Forbidden Memories would end, which is already a pretty exceptional feat to do, as this game can be extremely punishing as well as frustrating when the 1% drop rates don't hit after hundreds of duels. But for those brave enough to go for 100%, the game is just getting started. The next major section of the run can take around 10 to 15 hours, and is the final A-Tech section of the run, with the first opponent being Nightmare, which is the final boss of Forbidden Memories, so getting successful A-Tech ranks as opposed to Pegasus is going to require a bit more concentration, and a lot of the times, a bit more luck. But the main reason you want to do the A-Tech grind before going for the final POW grind is getting the S and A POW ranks, while very simple to do, are much harder to get against the more difficult opponents, as winning in 3 or 4 turns against someone with Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon is going to be much harder than an opponent that you can completely dominate in every single duel. So the main cards you want to grab from Nightmare are some cards that are not only just ones that help complete your collection, but also ones that can help with the later POW grinds, such as Tremendous Fire from Nightmare or Spellbinding Circle from Meadow Mage. The rest of the pre-POW grind is just grabbing a couple of required cards from opponents, such as My Valentine for Silver Bow and Arrow, and Keith for Mystical Moon. One other thing to mention is that some of these cards, while only dropped by one opponent or one opponent reliably, sometimes can be ignored during a run if everything else useful has been obtained from that opponent, or you're just getting fed up, as certain cards can be bought with Star Chips. Star Chips are awarded at the end of every duel, depending on how high of a rank you get, with S ranks giving you a total of 5 Star Chips. And towards the end of the game, when only a few cards remain, you can use all of the Star Chips that you have stacked up and purchase the remaining cards needed. But after the final A-Tech rank grind is over, it is time to get comfy, as the final A-POW farm is here, and this one on average can take about 24 hours. As mentioned before, A-Tech farms are very tedious and time-consuming for each battle, but the final A-POW farm, it's downright frustrating. Getting SNA POW in the early game is a breeze, as most opponents can just get overrun by a single twin-headed or one decently statted monster, but trying to get an A-POW rank against opponents that have this can obviously be a bit tricky. There are a handful of ways to achieve a POW rank, but the general strategy applies. You just have to win as quickly as possible, don't use many trap or spell cards, don't fuse, and don't lose life. And that's it, super simple. You just don't lose to the Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon without any fuses, without any traps or spells. It's just a walk in the park. The main strategy for dealing with this farm is to start with a widespread ruin, which will destroy any attack monster on the opposing team, which in this game, the way the opponent's AI is built, they will always lead with their strongest monster, and if it never gets activated, this means that they'll just never attack, which is also pretty good. You then want to mainly use monsters that don't require fusion, such as all the Meteor Black Dragons that you obtained, as well as any monsters with a decent attack stat, typically over 2000, preferably much higher. The other most important strategy is to have as many equips as you can possibly add to your deck, as using anywhere from 1 to 4 equips won't lower your starting 50-point score by anything at all, and being able to consistently equip your large monsters with at least 2 will typically make them strong enough to win. The first part of this grind is going against Seto 3, which is the most annoying opponent in the entire game, with very consistent Blue Eyes ultimates and a ton of trap cards at his disposal. But the main required card to get from Seto 3 is Blue Eyes White Dragon, which only drops from Seto 3 and sits at around a 1.2% drop rate. Another thing about the 100% run in Forbidden Memories is that some cards are actually not obtained in their raw card form, but another way to add to the library is just to fuse it in a duel or even a ritual summon. For example, since Twin-Headed Thunder Dragon is fused very frequently, you don't actually have to unlock the card itself for it to be added to your library. But on the other side of the coin, cards like Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon, they aren't unlockable. So instead of having to get lucky on the 1.2% on Seto 3, you have to get the 1.2% 3 times in order to unlock 3 Blue Eyes White Dragons, so you can use the ritual to summon Ultimate on your own board. Seto 3 is probably the most frustrating opponent in the game to face. Even with a crafted deck with over 10 equips, can still just win games or stall and make games take forever. But after the 3 Blue Eyes White Dragons are collected, he never has to be seen again. But the run is still very far from over. Haishin is the next farm and takes just as long, if not much longer than Seto 3, with a ton of required drops sitting at a 0.2% drop rate, such as Harpy's Pet Dragon. There are a handful of 0.2% drop rate cards from Haishin, so this section of the run can either be over extremely quickly with a ton of luck, or take so long that some runners just end up giving up, as putting in 15 or 20 hours and not getting the cards you want feels really bad, especially because you're making no progress at all, except for just collecting a couple of star chips. And if you somehow manage to survive obtaining 3 Blue Eyes White Dragons and every single one of Haishin's low drop rate cards that aren't affordable in the shop, the run is in its home stretch. And by home stretch, maybe like another 10 or 15 hours. At this point in the 100%, there isn't really a straightforward path, as most people's unlocks outside of the required grinds will be all over the place. Some people might have to go back and get more ATEX for equipment, some people may be missing a ton of monsters, and some just might have to grind out a ton of star chips to buy the remaining cards they're missing. And unless someone gets some crazy luck, a combination of the 3 is probably going to be required, and depending on the cards you have yet to unlock, determines which opponents you'll have to revisit. Other than that, as mentioned before, all of the ritual summons as well as fusions have to be done in order to unlock them in the library, as well as making sure you didn't miss a duel against any opponent within the game. But once all of the cleanup is finished and all 722 cards are unlocked in the library, with every duelist also being unlocked in Free Duel, the 100% run of Forbidden Memories is over. Forbidden Memories holds a special place in my heart, and while I never want to do this myself, 100% completing this game is such an impressive feat that I think it might be one of the hardest challenges in any Yu-Gi-Oh game out there. But as many of you have been very vocal to tell me, Reshef of Destruction gives this game a run for its money. So if 100%ing Forbidden Memories still pales in comparison to Reshef, I might just have to see if I can beat it myself.